All right, welcome everyone from across Canada and potentially other parts of the world. We know that we might have some folks from Europe joining us today, but welcome to our Housing First Specific Community of Practice series. Today we have the special privilege of being able to talk about the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness and a Housing First Toolkit project that we are doing from the TTA in conjunction with the NAERRH. That's always a mouthful. But we're excited to be part of that project with them. And we're excited to have you folks here today with us for this webinar. And so just a couple of things. Myself, I'm Wally Czech. I'm the director of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I apologize, guys. I didn't get your pictures in time to plug them in. But I'll have you on there in another one. But I am the director of training, and just a slight bit about the Canadian Alliance. We have multiple facets. We have the national conference, which again, it's important to note, has been moved to 2021, and it will be held in Toronto this time. We also have Built for Zero Canada, which is specific to coordinated access and by name list development for communities, and they have a cohort of communities involved with that. And then the TTA, and then of course the Allied Networks, which is where the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness fits in. I would encourage people to go to the Canadian Alliance website and see the different networks and groups and organizations that are tied to the Allied Networks. They're folks that we work with and support and help move their agendas along as well. So that's all there. Our mission with the training and technical assistance is pretty simple: helping communities and organizations end homelessness with expert training and technical assistance. And we are continually building our repertoire and portfolio and ability to do that. So this is another exciting opportunity to participate in something new along those lines. It's important for us to mention Reaching Home, as their funding in part makes this possible and makes us able to do a lot of the work that we do. So we're grateful to them and for the dollars that they provide for a really important cause. Our agenda for today is, I got a couple of housekeeping items that I'll share, and I'm going to introduce our presenters and the topic, and then turn it over to them, and they'll provide some presentation with some slides. I think there'll be probably some discussion in and amongst those slides. And then we'll have time for some more questions and discussion at the end. And then we'll do a little bit of wrap up, and we'll close off for this webinar. So just in terms of the community of practice format, we'll be going for an hour. We'll try not to go much longer than that if we do it all. The idea behind these is to provide good information and concrete ideas and best practice material. And there'll be a presentation, and normally the community of practice is about a presentation with then discussion, as opposed to a typical webinar, which is really just giving information. But as with all of our webinars, this is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the TTA website along with the PDF version of the slides for people to access later on. That will likely be up and available by the end of the day today, if not tomorrow morning. With the Q&A function, especially at the end, but even during, it's going to be important for you to indicate through the chat or through the Q&A function that you have a question or that you have a comment you'd like to make. And if you would also indicate if you have a question, whether you're willing to actually speak to it, and then we'll unmute you and you can actually talk with us. But depending upon how many questions and the amount of time we have available, we may just read out the questions. So we'll play that by ear as we go along. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. We have for you today Terrilee Kelford and Shane Peltier, and they are the co-chairs of the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. They're both very experienced individuals in the realm of ending homelessness and have been part of and initiated and pioneered some great programs and work in the area, in particular in the area of Housing First with youth, and Housing First in a rural and remote context. So I'm going to turn it over to them. I think Terrilee is going to go first and talk a little bit about the NAERRH and let them introduce themselves a little bit further. So go ahead, Terrilee, take it away.
Great, thanks, Wally. I'm not sure why I giggle every time someone tries to say our acronym for our name, but it is a mouthful for sure. So Terrilee Kelford, I'm the co-chair of the National Alliance to End Rural Remote Homelessness with Shane, and I'm going to make him do most of the work on this webinar. But I just wanted to speak quickly to the National Alliance and some of the work that we're doing right now. We do have a website, as was mentioned, so it's naerrh.ca. And you can find any of these webinars that we record and the resources we're creating on that website. But just quickly, so you know, we started the National Alliance to End Rural Remote Homelessness in November of 2018. We pulled together a group of individuals, communities, and national organizations from across the country to start talking about rural and remote homelessness, because from my experience, as I wear two hats on this webinar, someone who works frontline in a rural community, definitely it felt like for the last 20 years for me, certainly, that the conversation often revolves around urban homelessness. And I've teased some of my colleagues that since we launched the National Alliance, it's almost impossible to find rural or remote homelessness media coverage to fill our social media sites with. So I often have to copy and paste urban communication and apply some rural context to it. So regardless, a goal of the National Alliance is really just to elevate the conversation around rural and remote homelessness and how we can actually help build resources and information, data, research to support rural communities in their work, because we know that there's great work happening right across the country in small communities. And that has certainly been validated since we launched the National Alliance. We hear stories all the time about the great work that's happening. So it's a question of helping build a network so that people have an opportunity to connect and learn from each other and advocate. So we certainly are doing some advocacy when it comes to the federal government and reaching home. We're asking for increases there to help rural communities get this work done. And we actually have a national research committee now as well. So researchers from across the country have come together to look at building the base of evidence and data and research to support rural communities and to help us advocate as well for increased resources. And we were also fortunate enough to have a rural remote stream provided to us by the CAH at their last conference. And so we were excited to have our second annual rural remote stream of content. Unfortunately, that has been delayed till 2021, but really exciting to see the response to that. And we do have a growing email list. I know email lists may not sound too exciting at first, but I promise you we don't inundate you with newsletters and all kinds of information. It really is a direct connection that we have to people doing the work on the front lines. And so we will send out all of our surveys, any research we're doing, any way that we can connect with you and to hear from you. It really is it serves as a direct connection for us. So you can also go to our website and get on that list there too. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to pass this over to Shane, and he's going to start to go through the results of a survey that we did as part of this project that we're working on to create an addendum to the national toolkit on Housing First. So we're going to be creating a remote specific resources and tools on there to help communities adopt Housing First across Canada. So Shane, take it over.
Thanks, Terrilee. I am going to jump in and start talking about these slides. Okay, so we put out a survey. We can't remember the exact date because, with COVID, it seems like a million years ago, but we know that it was sometime in January. So the survey went out in January. We had 66 respondents. Primarily, we put it out through the contact list that we have through the email. We put it out on social media, of course, and I anticipate it went through the Canadian Alliance newsletter. Like I said, in total, we had 66 respondents with a large showing in Ontario and Newfoundland. Which we kind of saw as a trend through the entire survey. The Ontario contingent we've placed into regionally central Canada, and as you can see here on this slide, they were the largest at 41% of all responses. We were unable to capture any responses from Quebec. However, I think in the future, with future surveys and things like that will be more targeted towards kind of directing some of those tools and requests like directly to entities we know in Quebec. We divided the communities up by size, with small being under 30,000 residents, rural being under 1,000, and remote being permanent settlements with at least 10 dwellings, with some transportation considerations. The bulk of our responses were from small communities, as you can see, representing 82% of all respondents. One of the limitations we encountered, and as we've been talking with different researchers in the rural and remote homelessness space, is that when we divide the communities up into size, we actually fail to capture many of the dimensions of rural homelessness that might exist among all three. For example, somebody who might live in a small community on the outskirts of a small community might actually be experiencing more rural typical or remote typical homelessness like indicators. And so although they might live in a bigger center, their experience might be that what we would see in those experiencing living in a smaller center. So just the different minutiae in that is really important to capture, and I think through research that is desperately needed in our country, that stuff can start to be teased out. As we look at the regional breakdown with the community sizing, we can see large percentages of remote respondents coming from Atlantic Canada, and the prairies with some, and the north, while central and west were predominantly, if not entirely, small communities. So really interesting to note that, yeah, in Atlantic Canada, primarily remote, and small communities were, you know, in the west and central, almost entirely small. I think that's all I have on this slide. Oh, did we want to do questions on each slide, or do we want to go on to and do questions at the end? I guess I'll invite everybody to, if you have questions on the slides, I'll keep my eyes on the chat window as well. If you have, sorry, go ahead, Wally.
You go ahead, Shane. I'll watch that stuff, and
okay.
If there's comments and things that come up, then I'll let you know.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Sure. So for this slide gives us a breakdown of communities that are currently delivering Housing First programming. This side. We divided this question into 3 parts: those with established Housing First programs, those who deliver Housing First in a partial way, and those who do not currently deliver Housing First programming. We see our highest uptake in the Atlantic region, with 12 out of 14 respondents reporting somewhat of a Housing First approach being delivered, followed by Central Canada with half of the respondents reporting Housing First delivery. The prairies and sorry, can you go back to that slide, Wally? Yeah, there you go. The prairies and west are predominantly not Housing First, and the north is sitting with a higher number when we look at the percentage-wise, at about 60% of their programming is done, is through a Housing First approach. Again, these are 66 respondents on this question, and you can see the regional breakdown there with regards to remote, rural, and small communities. Okay, on slide 3. Slide 3 is, I always love these slides, these indicator slides. It really puts you in the, you know, in the mind of the respondents. What were they experiencing? What were they thinking? As you can see in our analysis, overall 30% of the survey participants do not believe that 24-hour supports will work in practice. We also had a high percentage of those who feel that choice and location work is not something that will work in practice in the rural and remote space. And then followed by, let's see, 23%, sorry, choice in type and location, and then 23% in choice and supports. We also had housing based on needs and wants, 24% in needs. See the breakdown there between those with programmings and with Housing First programs and those without. And so one of the things we felt kind of came through in this is there wasn't a huge disparity between those with and those without programs. As you can see, they're pretty split down the middle as far as the responses. On to the next slide, Wally.
Can I just add something quick,
Sure.
Shane?
Yeah, go. Yeah, perfect.
I think that with those things, in particular with choice, what we have found is that across the board, the principle of choice is actually one of the most misunderstood housing first principles. It seems like it would be so simple, but it is actually misunderstood in terms of what, of how it is incorporated, or how it actually works in a housing first context. And so, you know, that could potentially be part of why that comes across as it is that these folks are no different than any other place in the world in terms of understanding what choice actually means. And then I would also just say that when it comes to the 24-hour component too, I think what this tells me is I'd like to be able to get a little deeper around what people feel like that is actually asking them, and what 24-hour supports looks like in their minds.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the really advantageous reasons why we're, you know, making an addendum to the existing Housing First Toolkit, is all of those trends that you would see that are typical in Housing First in urban centers or in you know, communities that are medium in size. It's interesting to kind of try and see which ones relate and which ones tie into a trend in a rural setting as well. So yeah, if we want to move on to slide 4, this is typical of what we would expect to see. Obviously, funding is a barrier. No housing options and sky-high rents. These are the ones that are 83% of respondents, both with and without Housing First programs, felt as though funding would be a barrier. You know, followed by no housing. I know for us, I predominantly work in rural communities, and housing is always an issue. Lack of not just landlords, but actually lack of you know, space to even build capital projects on. So that's a huge issue. And then of course the rents and how the market far outpaces the subsidies or the programs that would be covering those things. One of the questions I did have through this slide was the lack of understanding of Housing First principles, or lack of Housing First understanding, at 45%, both those with established programs and those without. I'd be interested to learn if that's, you know, where that falls in, like in the infrastructure of the entity. Is that a board level, or managerial or frontline level, or is it the community perhaps that doesn't understand Housing First? And it also presents kind of an opportunity about where we go with that. And that's kind of what this toolkit is all about, is understanding what needs to be developed and where to be placing our priorities. Another interesting response was the 3% of not being able to find homelessness. So again, questions of, is this the hidden homelessness? Is this the couch surfing population? Or are these rough sleeping people in camps that are kind of on the outskirts that maybe perhaps don't want to be found, or that outreach workers can't find? So, you know, again, this is a question about where, you know, what are the respondents thinking when they're replying to these questions? Community support. In large part, this is seen within areas of established Housing First programs where they're being delivered. You know, I have questions about whether or not this is trending up or down. So since the Housing First program started in the community, has the community support increased, or has it decreased for the programming in the community? And then of course, it would be interesting to unravel what elements and why that is. And then another thing too is the capacity to run. I would question, you know, in rural communities, is this infrastructural in nature, or is this perhaps there's no skilled, you know, workers in the community that might be able to offer those supports, or what have you? And I think one of the elements, I know for me personally as a project coordinator through Reaching Home in a funding role, one of our roles is capacity building. And so in these communities, that perhaps have a Housing First or don't have a Housing First, what kind of partnerships and is there an active kind of back and forth with your funders in regards to that capacity building, and could there be opportunities there? So a lot of kind of questions about these indicators that come out. And of course, again, if you have any questions about the responses, please put them in the chat.
I think
when
you look at the big four, you know, those are not surprises, right? You know, well,
yeah,
we don't have funding, we don't have services and supports, we don't have housing, and the rents are too high. Like those are things that we would automatically assume, but I think it just goes to show that those are areas that we have to be able to be creative about in terms of you know, how to make those things different in a rural and remote perspective.
Yeah, and I would add too that one of the advantages I have working in the rural and remote space is that those are the places where I see the greatest innovation, the greatest creativity, the greatest working outside of the box. And it's always found, I find, in the frontline workers of the communities I'm working in. You know, when you're in a community and you're a rural worker, you have to wear 3 or 4 different hats. You have to be answering A, B, C, and D need. And so when it comes to these, you know, lack of support services or what have you, you know, that's where I really see where the research needs to be done in the rural space, because the most innovative responses to homelessness I'm finding in the rural space, and that's, you know, working in both the urban and rural settings. And so although the challenges are high and the barriers remain, I feel like the responses are you know, are matched with that in the level of innovation that comes through. So yeah, again, I would go back to highlighting that it's the people in the rural communities. And I heard Dr. Faye Martin say recently that it was in rural communities, people are the assets, and I would echo that. That in the communities that I work in, it's the people doing the work that are truly the you know, the assets. So on to the next slide.
And actually, I'm just going to pull this.
Go ahead.
Here,
yeah,
because I think I missed one when I transferred them, but this is the last one, right? Whoops.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yep. Oh, sorry, you want to pop it out that way? Okay. Yeah. So this one, this is our you know, homeless counts that are being done in the rural urban in the rural centers. You can see that I was highlighting that Central Canada is finally toppled by the North representing, showing 100% of respondees, respondents stated that they do counts in the North. And then of course we see the real dip in Atlantic Canada. I'd be curious to know if that is a fundamental or funding or capacity issue with regards to counts. What's going on there? That people aren't doing the counts, or at least in the field of respondents, they're not seeing too many counts being done there. Yeah, I think the conversation about homelessness counts is, you know, it's back and forth, and we're all aware of you know, the barriers and the advantages of doing the counts and the challenges with the counts. But I think one of the interesting or you know, prospects for me is I'd really like to see a homeless count done through the lens of the urban or the Indigenous definition of homelessness. I think that would be really neat in rural communities to actually use that definition and do a count through those dimensions of homelessness and the 12 dimensions. But again, as the survey was short, and I think through a lot of the questions, one of the main questions that, or you know, one of the main things that we came to was that there's definitely more research that's needed in this space. We don't really know overall what the size of rural and remote homelessness is in Canada. And not only that, but we don't really know, you know, the size of the service delivery response to rural homelessness. And so I think through research, we can uncover some of those realities. And I know I've asked, the Reaching Home ESDC headquarters for some stats on, okay, so how many rural and remote sub-projects are out there? How many applicants are there, looking for rural and remote homelessness funding, and some of those stats, and they haven't gotten back to me about that yet. But I think that's information that's really, really key and really vital, is especially if we have communities out there that have workers, they have the infrastructure, they have the ability to be delivering these services, and they're just not connected to that funding. How can we connect them to that funding and start building that capacity in those communities to respond to rural homelessness? So I'm looking forward to more research in this area, and I know Terrilee has more to say on kind of what's being developed and what's up and coming through the National Alliance and all of the work that's being done on that. And so for us, that's the end of the slide presentation. We only had 5 or 6 slides. Again, the survey was really small. We didn't touch on COVID. This was well, it wasn't pre-COVID, but it was pre-North American, pre-Canada COVID. And so it might be a refreshing break from a lot of the COVID webinars and material that's coming out. But yeah, again, a lot of the services going forward and research and focus going forward in rural communities will of course be that, how are we responding to COVID in those spaces? But for us, that was our survey, and I hope that it drew out a couple questions. But yeah.
Shane, just in response to your COVID comment, I think what I don't know that this is so much removed from COVID actually at all, because I think what we've learned and what we hope people will start to grasp onto even more is that housing is going to be the best solution in terms of homelessness, to be able to mitigate what's going on with COVID. And so in that sense, you may have heard the term housing is the best healthcare for our homeless population. And so I think this just brings to light the importance of that idea of housing first, and that we stop worrying about all of those other factors, and that we get people into housing, and then we can address those things later. Because what we need people to be is safe and in an environment where they can actually start to do the other work that they need to do, and do it at their own pace, and kind of in a way that's driven by them. And that's really kind of the crux of housing first, right? That it's a person-centered methodology to ending homelessness, which kind of flies in the face of what our traditional methods have been in the past.
I would echo that, Wally. Actually, just if I wear my other hat as the chair of Cornerstone Land and Use Services in Leonard County, really COVID didn't affect our agency at all, other than we were providing additional supports in terms of helping kids meet basic needs. But in terms of the Housing First for Youth program we run, it was really business as usual, because we use the Housing First program. So we didn't have to worry as much about communal spaces. And, a lot of our young people were in individual homes and apartments, and, some in room rentals. There's definitely an overcrowding issue. But really the only young people we had to support out of about 58 cases we were supporting was 2 or 3 that were actually in boarding houses with 30 or 40 people in them. So, but all that to say, it was just extra validation. We're already huge champions of the cause of Housing First, but it was just extra validation that during a health crisis like we've experienced in this pandemic, Housing First is definitely the way to go. So extra validation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see that too in the communities we have Housing First programs. When with regards to crisis response, when you don't have to deal with that initial, oh my God, we got to get these people housed, we got to get people off the street, we got to get, especially at the time of year it was when projects, some of our winter sheltering projects were just ending, and so. Here we have a shelter that's closing on March 31st, and everybody's going to be, going back to their summering camps and communities, and in often cases back to their First Nation for the summer. Here we were concerned about where these people were going to go, and we needed to create physical distancing and housing. obviously being the number one, but in our communities with Housing First, we didn't have to deal with that healthcare element of it. We already had the housing in place, and now it was, how do we, eviction prevention and landlord relations, and how do we continue that social integration through the crisis and things of that nature. So yeah, it really did take a little bit of the edge off of the knife for us in those spaces.
Yeah, there were a couple of comments to some of the things that you said in the chat, in particular around agreeing that using the definition of Indigenous homelessness would be beneficial in terms of doing counts, and then there was also one other comment about from Marianne McKittrick, where she was saying that some of the best youth homelessness prevention is found in rural communities. Not everything is translatable, but urban centers can learn a lot from rural communities. I asked her if she wanted to talk, but she didn't respond, so I think she did. Important
to note, though, that Mary Jane is with Away Home Canada, and they're members of the National Alliance right from the beginning, founding organization. So
yeah, definitely pioneers as well in that youth homelessness world. So I mean, people I think are resonating with some of the comments that were made.
Yeah, and I think when, like, to respond to Mary Jane and her comments about the youth homelessness prevention, in rural communities, and we would know this working in those places, but it's so community centric, right? Like it's done as a community, and oftentimes, in the communities I'm working in, these are our family, these are our neighbors, we know who they are. Those people that are experiencing homelessness, we grew up with them. They've been around the community. It's a very community and family centric response that needs to be done. And that is where I believe the innovation really lies, is in going back to those Indigenous paradigms, those Indigenous worldviews of community-based practice and the tribal teachings and all of those approaches, I feel like, are really the innovation that's being missed. And can you translate them into an urban setting? Well, of course. We see that when we see different programs pop up that use that community-based kind of response, even through a Housing First model. We see that in Edmonton through Niganan Housing. That's run by Corolla down there. They definitely use a Housing First model approach in regards to their service delivery, and they have great success. And so you can see that translate into an urban setting, but you find it predominantly in those rural communities, because that's how they have to, out of necessity. They have to have those responses.
Yeah. I think that makes me think of housing. So one of the barriers that's always, and certainly was, identified in our survey, the definition of housing, what is housing, is often a stumbling block. So we don't have housing. And people often have this very scripted sort of, idea of what housing is. It's got to be social housing. It's got to be, an individual apartment on your own. And I think one thing that we've seen significant results with in Lanark County is allowing the individual we work with, and that goes back to choice and being person-centered, they get to find what housing is for them. So we don't tell them they're homeless. So if they're staying with their friends for a couple of weeks, they're staying with their friends for a couple of weeks, and then we can look for longer term apartment, room rental, whatever it is that they want. The plan is defined by them. And so if that means also staying with parents of a friend or parents of a partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, that's housing for them, and that's okay. And the same thing happens for adults. It's not just a youth oriented philosophy or approach. Even though we're a youth agency in Lanark County, I get calls about adults across our county often. And often it's from parents of a 45-year-old, where the person is struggling with mental health issues and they want to support them at home. So it's a question of having support. So really what they need is, perhaps some financial support to maintain that housing, and then just wrapping them in supports while they're at home with the parent. But we tend to be a little inflexible when it comes to systems. Sometimes we're a little rigid in our approaches to these things. So we really need to, you know, pull all those pieces together of choice and, you know, person-centered approaches and wrap people in the supports that they want when they want it. And so, so that's worked really well for us in Leonard County. So using community, allowing the individual to define what home is for them. And so that's worked well for us. So when I hear that, that's a really common barrier I hear is we just don't have housing. And certainly in Leonard County, we've had exploding house prices. And we use primarily scattered site private market housing for our program. But again, we've always allowed the individual to choose what housing is for them.
You know, Terrilee, that's, I think, a great example of what I was referring to earlier about some of the misconceptions or misunderstandings about some of the Housing First principles. There's often this sort of contrast that I don't even know, or contradiction that I don't even know if people realize is a contradiction when they think about housing first. As you said, for a long time, you know, it was sort of, it only is about scattered site housing, but that's a contradiction to choice. And so what we know is that the better someone is matched to the things that they are needing and wanting in their life, the better the outcomes and success is. And that's been researched. And so it doesn't make any sense that if someone in your Housing First program is saying they would like to live in a shared accommodation situation, but because you're saying no, Housing First is about scattered site, that's not an offer, well, then you're actually operating in opposition to Housing First. And so I think those kinds of things need to be clarified as well for people to really be able to be sure that they are following that Housing First model or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that as a segue into why it's so important to involve people with lived experience into the building out of your Housing First program. And not only that, but the ongoing evaluation and kind of creating that feedback loop of existing programming. You know, people want to see themselves reflected in their services. And when that happens, the success rates are increased. I know that, you know, the including people lived experience thing, you know, kind of, we saw a big trend and it was the cool thing to do. But it really is based on best practice. And I know I've been having conversations to draw experience from other sectors with regards to ableism and trying to fit, you know, a circle person into a square housing hole, and how, you know, are we going back to these people and asking them, you know, hey, what is, like you're saying, Terrilee, you know, what is a home for you, and how can we help create that? And in that space, I think, is where we find success most often.
Yeah. Tiffany, I see there's a comment that's coming from Tiffany, and I agree. Are you gonna ask? Yeah, does she want to speak? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, go ahead and talk, Terrilee, and I'll see if she wants. I'll
okay, for sure. So yeah, don't get me wrong. I think there's definitely barriers to options. And I would say even when I'm doing the frontline work with people, we don't have the housing we would like to be able to offer people either. We don't have the variety of housing. However, what we do try to do is always present options. So whatever that is, if there's a room rental, we offer that. If there's a boarding house temporarily for long-term housing, we offer that. If they want an apartment, we offer that. But we make sure that we offer the same supports to all of it. So we will provide financial support and wrap services around a client, even if they're, like I said, with an extended family member. We don't say, oh, you're with family, now you're on your own. We move our program to the housing needs of the person. So we definitely don't have the housing we want and the choices we want, but we definitely provide choice to the client at all times when we can.
So Tiffany, you are able to speak. If you want to unmute yourself, you can respond to that, but you don't have to. Just letting you know. I wonder if in the meantime, if, you know, and I would again encourage people to make any comments or ask any questions that they have at this point in time, but I wonder if we should maybe provide people with a little bit of what's next with this project.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. I just want to jump on and just make one comment to Tiffany. You know, I worked in Housing First for a long time, and we dealt with this. We dealt with landlords that didn't want to rent to our clients in communities. And in a community that only has 15 available units or 10 or 5, when you have a landlord that doesn't want to work with your program anymore as a Housing First program, you know, these relationships with landlords, these are relationships, right? And sometimes they take a long time to grow and to nurture. And I feel like you have to both balance that speaking to good business, i.e., hey, guaranteed rents and all of the financial aspect of it, but also balancing that relationship and working with that landlord over time to really, first and foremost, build that relationship over you're a landlord and we're a renter, and that's all we're ever going to be. I think that's key in building those partnerships.
Yeah. I would add to that, Shane, and just say that with the increasing house prices, our housing caseworkers, even in Leonard County, are taking people to as many as 15 and 16 showings before a landlord will rent to them. And landlords are making all kinds of inappropriate comments about, I won't rent to anybody on assistance, I won't rent to somebody your age, I won't rent to somebody without, you know, full-time jobs. There's all these barriers, but, you know, regardless, we take just a relentless approach to it. So that landlord said no, we move on to the next. That landlord said no, we move on to the next until we find housing. And it only ultimately takes one. So once you can get in there and get the person housed, then you know, that's all you need to do. So it takes extra work for sure, and you can't give up. And certainly the housing caseworkers have also been the reason why we've been given apartment placements for young people specifically, because landlords have gotten to know us in the community, and those relationships have started to build, and so it's gotten a little bit easier. But as more competition is increased because of increasing rent prices, that's an issue as well. But we also offer rent supplements as part of our program too, so that helps landlords too to know that they've got a guaranteed income coming in too.
Well, when you find that one, the landlords talk, and if things go well, then you never know what doors that opens for other landlords because they've shared that information. But the only thing I would also add to what you guys are saying is that I think that just because a landlord or multiple landlords are saying no, I won't rent to your program or whatever the case is, that doesn't mean that your efforts with that landlord are done. I think that opens the door to be able to say, well, listen, then help us to understand what makes that a difficult choice for you, and engage in those conversations with them, and engage other landlords and say, can you come forward and meet with us and talk to us about why you don't want to do this, and help us to understand what we could do differently or better to mitigate some of those challenges or issues, and pull them into the fold, so to speak, and bring them in as actually part of the support process. Even if they're not going to rent to you, that doesn't mean they don't have valuable information. That doesn't mean they can't be of assistance in helping you to reach other landlords or to tweak things about your program or what you do that might all of a sudden change their minds. And then you never know, right? I mean, there's situations where landlords that were deemed the most difficult and challenging have ended up being huge champions for the cause in the end, because they were able to work things out, and then it went well, and they're now fans of the program. But
Yes.
That case management piece is a really important piece, because the last thing you want to do is you get a landlord to finally agree, and then you're not providing the appropriate follow-up and support to the people that you've put in their unit. And oftentimes that's the very reason why they struggle with it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, just before we move on, I want to just touch on one piece too, which I thought was important today as well, around choice too. And I think, and also housing options. Sometimes I think the lack of choice we feel we have as service providers for folks also, you know, builds up frustration because we don't feel like we have what we want to offer clients for sure. And I think sometimes that disadvantages our clients as well. So let me give you an example. So if we don't have a whole variety of what we think the housing option should be, if we don't provide full choice to people, if someone chooses to stay outside because the option we're offering them, or feel like the only option we have to offer them, I've heard repeatedly, well, we've offered them services and they don't want it. But if what you're offering them is only one option, then the problem is not the individual, it's the lack of choice that we've been able to provide them. That may be very true for your community. You may have a lack of choice, but it doesn't mean that we should stop trying. So as service providers, we always have to keep trying to offer a variety of supports and services to people, and always go back and continue to provide them a choice. So we can't just stop when we give them the one option and they choose not to take that option. We got to keep being, again, relentless in our pursuit of trying to provide supports and a variety of options for people. So, and I think that's a big hurdle to Housing First, right? Is you hear often that Housing First doesn't work because of these reasons. Well, Housing First always works. You just may not have the resources or the options that you want to provide people, but Housing First always works. It's just a question of finding ways to make it fit within your community based on the resources and the options that you have.
Just to add quickly to that, I also think you have to remember that it may not even always be about that you don't have what they want. What you might not have is you might not have their trust. And
Sure.
Sometimes that comes into play where you might have the most ideal place for them, but they've been burned in the past. They've been told that they would get certain services or supports, or the system has beaten them down so many times over and over again that for them, this is it's just words. It's just chatting in their face, and it means nothing. And until eventually they realize that, you know what, this person or this program isn't going away, and they continue to talk to me, and I haven't seen any evidence that they're going to do things differently than what they say. So maybe this is the opportunity. Maybe this is something's going to change here.
That is one of the negative consequences to having to take individuals to 15 and 16 and 17 showings, is eventually they start to give up. It's a really hard process for them to go through and to be constantly rejected by landlords, and to have really inappropriate things said to them, quite frankly, which happens on showings. And so, we've definitely had young people say, I'm kind of done. I don't want to do another showing. And so that's, again, not about choice. It's them giving up on a system that's just not working and not getting the supports they need. So
I just wanted to follow up with Dawn. Dawn had a follow-up comment talking about ads that are posted that even comment on, the barriers, the things that they won't allow. And it's so true, and it happens, and it's frustrating, and it's deflating, and I get it. But to me, that's about, again, education and constant relentless effort working towards making those attitudes change. Because I mean, if you went to that same landlord who potentially fell on hard times and had to sell their house and now needed to rent somewhere or whatever, if they were told themselves that they weren't allowed to have an overnight guest, I wonder how they'd respond to that, right? And so it's not as simple as going to them and saying, you're being a hypocrite, but it's about helping them to see that the folks we're trying to work with are human beings as well, and they deserve the same kinds of opportunities as everybody else who's renting would deserve.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear the comments, and if we we don't have that's one piece you don't often have the time to do, is to go back and repair every single one of those relationships when you've been to 15 showings, but but you will get the odd one in there that's totally engageable and you can follow up with and build a rapport with, for sure. And that personal experience is important, for sure. So I see Ramsey in here from Leonard County making a comment too about rural communities. Ramsey, this is a really good question. I think that it's a curiosity I have as well. Certainly, I think Ontario is in a bit of a unique position, though, and I've talked to Shane and Wally both about this, and I think this goes back to homelessness counts and the percentage of responses we got from Ontario, and the surveys around that too. Ontario had a mandatory count, which was just cancelled last year, but so every municipality in Ontario did a count. But in Ontario, the housing portfolio was offloaded by the province to municipalities, and I believe we're the only province in Canada where that's the case. So municipalities actually are directed the funding through the province for housing. So what happens in other communities across Canada, I'd be curious to know. It's something actually that would be interesting to do a survey around specifically, is who's taking the lead on these programs. But certainly even in Ontario, I would say I'd be curious to know what the percentages of municipalities taking the lead on Housing First versus nonprofits. Wally may have more experience with this because he travels across the country providing Housing First training to folks. But I would argue, I would guess that there's probably more nonprofits adopting Housing First than there are actual municipalities. But again, I'd love to see some data on that to back that up. I think in Ontario, because the municipalities are responsible for the housing portfolio, they should all be adopting Housing First, like today. But and nonprofits should be able to support and participate and, you know, be part of the community plan and wrap supports around that. But unfortunately, that's not my experience so far. So Wally, could you add to that?
Well, you know, what's interesting about that is that even in a lot of nonprofit organizations, we find sometimes a discrepancy between the program that is funded by the nonprofit and their values around Housing First versus the actual overall organization's value system. And that often creates a real dilemma when you have, you know, let's say you have a program, and I apologize, I'm not saying that CMHA does this. It was just the first organization that came to my mind. But let's say you have a CMHA who they also manage a Housing First program. There may be an overarching philosophical difference between the CMHA organization versus the Housing First program that they're managing or operating, because there's some discrepancies in beliefs. And again, I'm not saying CMHA is that way, but we see this all the time, that there's these challenges. And so the Housing First project is trying to implement the principles and trying to follow the model, but the overarching organization, whether it's a municipality or a nonprofit, sometimes hasn't completely bought in to that philosophy.
Yeah. Well, and I hear often from municipalities that, you know, they just don't have the resources to do it, that a lot of their staffing is directed towards just managing the housing units they have. So they're more like landlords and property managers, and they don't have enough time to do the Housing First support piece. However, I would say the same is true of nonprofits in rural communities. So, you know, the Reaching Home and advocacy piece that we're trying to do at the National Alliance has increased significantly the rural remote stream of funding through Reaching Home. So in Ontario, there was only, I think, you know, $1.3 million worth of funding for all rural or remote communities in Ontario to do for housing through Reaching Home, which is significantly underfunded. So there's millions and millions of dollars worth of applications that go in versus the amount of money that there is to give out. So nonprofits are really underfunded as well. So it's not really an argument that holds water with me, but at the same time, it is a reality. And I think those two should be working together. So regardless of who takes the lead, municipalities and nonprofits should be working together. Both can work really well together. And so, you know, when it comes to those community supports in rural communities, you may not have all the supports you want to create an official ACT team, but there's certainly, you know, lots of resources and supports within rural communities to be able to wrap people in community-based supports. So again, they should be working together regardless of who takes the lead.
I think that's also the benefit of the coordinated access movement, right? Because that forces the system to come on board and adopt that model and philosophy. And so, but one thing we also always see when we do trainings is that it's generally, you know, frontline staff that attend the trainings, and they regularly say at the end of a training, oh, that's all great, but I don't think our management will allow us to make these adjustments or changes. But the management isn't there, right? And so I know people who attend trainings often feel frustrated because they're getting great information that may not be able to be incorporated later because the people who make the decisions to allow that aren't even part of the training.
Yeah. And we don't have time to get into by name lists and coordinated access, Wally, but it's a whole nother discussion we should be having. Because certainly one of the biggest problems I would see with a lot of municipalities too is they just have no ability to prioritize. And so people just sit on waiting lists for years. And so it's a first come, first serve sort of approach, which really is not helpful.
What does that look like in a rural perspective as well?
Yeah.
For Ramsey, I would just add, keep your eye on how the right to housing legislation in Canada affects these specific governmental bodies down the road. You know, if we start putting some teeth in that you know, with regards to like a housing advocate and a housing advisory council and things like that, like a homelessness advisory council nationally, I'd like to see how that kind of comes down to municipalities, or there's those spaces where governmental bodies are running the housing sector.
Well, you should probably pass this over to you because we're at.
Yeah. Sorry, Wally.
No. This is great conversation, and you know, from the comments we're getting, I think it's helpful, and it's kind of framing things for people. I just think it's important that we kind of let people know where we're going to go with this, and we have some other pieces happening, but we're going to continue to follow up with all of the folks who are on this call, if they're willing, and anybody else from the rural and remote perspective, to continue to get feedback. And we're going to dig down and get a little bit more into the minutia of some of these things so that we can understand them a little bit better. But we've also got a component of things where there's some rural and remote communities that are operating Housing First programs that have agreed to participate in sort of a pre and post self-fidelity assessment with regards to Housing First. In the end, that will help to inform a rural and remote specific Housing First fidelity checklist, as well as it will continue to help inform our efforts in building the content for this toolkit addendum. And within that, we hope to be able to offer, you know, policy ideas, housing ideas, multiple other things that might be more specific or helpful from a rural and remote perspective, so that people can go to that part of the toolkit and be able to get some really helpful tools and resources and framework around implementing an effective Housing First model. But we will be having some additional webinars down the road as part of this as well. And so we hope to be able to engage as many of you as possible. Is there anything else you guys want to say about that in terms of the next steps with this particular project?
No, I would just add, don't hesitate to reach out to Shane or Wally or I as well. And while you haven't really talked about the training that you guys offer at the CAH, but you know, the CAH is a fantastic resource for communities right across Canada. So there you go. They're an agency that's extremely accessible. You can reach out to them and they will offer you all kinds of support. So they're working across the country.
These are just some ideas of the type of training we do, but we'll also do consultation and specific community coaching, those kinds of things, system work, all of that stuff. But my little guy here is just showing that because of the world we live in today, but also because I think it's important regardless, is we've now moved into the world of virtual training. And so we are, in fact, we're starting next week with some training with NAERRH region, and doing some stuff online with them in regards to Housing First and assertive engagement for their outreach programs and those kinds of things. So we have a whole list of training options that you can see on our website, which is not actually complete at the moment. We're in the process of working on that and changing that. And then I also just wanted to add and make a note of our new learning management system that we're putting into place. And we'll be having a platform where we'll be hosting different modules that will work for communities in terms of onboarding, new staff, and various other things. And we'll be doing some of our live virtual trainings through that platform as well. And I think that we'll probably also be able to have some of the resources that we pull out of the this toolkit project that we'll be able to create as modules on that platform. And so we're looking at having subscriptions and things like that available, and there'll be free stuff, and then there'll be things that people can get access to on a course by course basis. But it's a huge helpful component. Other than the increased revenue piece for communities who might access this learning management platform that we have, all of these other things are benefits of being able to access something like that. You've all done probably some sort of an online course somewhere, and we'll have the capacity to do things like that throughout, you know, multiple topics of training. But it could be a huge benefit to communities in helping them along the way. So that's my spiel for today. Do you guys have any closing comments?
No, just again, if you get a chance, go to our National Alliance website and get on our email list if you can. Again, we're not going to inundate you with all kinds of online newsletters and scripts, but it is really a direct connection to us. And as we move forward with this project, it's going to be really important for us to continue to build on the voices and the input that we've had so far. So thanks everyone who attended.
Shane, anything from you?
Nope.
Okay.
Just stay safe and stay well and stay happy.
Yeah, and just a reminder, people, this recording will be available by the end of the day or tomorrow morning through the TTA website, training.cah.ca. And if you just go into the webinar section, you'll see an archive section and a Housing First Community of Practice section. So it'll all be there for you, including the slides. So have a great day and be careful out there.